The air was thick with the scent of old books and the faint musk of his cologne, a reckless alchemy that clung to my skin long after I left his room. That night, the first night, replays in my mind like a fevered dream I cannot shake. Julian's breath was hot against my neck, his fingers trembling as they grazed the edge of my blouse, a touch so tentative yet searing it unravelled every thread of my restraint. I was his tutor, his guide through the labyrinth of literature and mathematics. But in that moment, I was no longer the woman who corrected his equations. I was a stranger to myself, caught in the pulse of his nearness, the rhythm of our bodies swaying closer, defying the boundaries we both knew were sacred. It began innocently enough, or so I told myself. The clock had ticked past 9. The house silent, save for the creak of the floorboards and the occasional hum of a car outside. Julian was sprawled across the desk, his dark hair falling into his eyes, frustration etching lines into his youthful face as he wrestled with a passage from Jane Eyre. I leaned over, my hand brushing his as I pointed to the text, and the air shifted. A subtle charge, like the moment before a storm breaks. His eyes met mine, not with the usual boyish curiosity, but with something deeper, hungrier. "Miss Eleanor," he said, his voice low, "do you ever feel lonely?" The question was a spark, igniting a fire I hadn't known was smouldering within me. I should have laughed it off, redirected him to the book, but my throat tightened. And my heart, oh my heart, betrayed me with its reckless thudding. I was 32, a woman who had long buried her desires under the weight of routine, a marriage that had grown cold, and a life that felt like a series of obligations. Julian was 17, on the cusp of manhood, his body lean and taut with the energy of youth, his gaze piercing through the armor I'd worn for years. "Sometimes," I whispered, and that was the moment the line blurred, the moment I let the forbidden take root. His hand found mine, not as a student seeking guidance, but as a man testing the waters of something dangerous. The touch was soft, a gentle collision of skin, but it sent a current through me, awakening parts of my soul I'd thought long dormant. I could have pulled away. I should have. But instead, I let my fingers linger, tracing the warmth of his palm, memorizing the texture of his skin. The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in until there was only us, two bodies drawn together by a force neither could name. "Tell me about women," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, his eyes searching mine with a mix of curiosity and something far more perilous. I laughed, a nervous sound, but it died quickly under the weight of his gaze. I tried to speak of love in abstract terms, of poetry and longing, but his questions grew bolder, his words laced with a rawness that stripped away my defenses. He wanted to know about desire, about the way a woman's body responds to touch. And I, God help me, I answered, my voice trembling as I spoke of sensations I hadn't felt in years. The first kiss was a collision, not of lips, but of wills, a surrender to the inevitable. He leaned across the desk, his breath mingling with mine, and I met him halfway, my hands tangling in his hair as our mouths found each other. It was not gentle, not tentative, but a desperate melding of need and defiance. His lips were warm, insistent, tasting of mint and rebellion, and I drank him in, my body arching toward his as if it had been starving for this very moment. The desk pressed into my hips, the edge biting into my flesh, grounding me even as my mind spiraled into chaos. We moved to the floor, the carpet rough against my back as he hovered above me, his weight a delicious pressure that anchored me to the present. His hands explored with a reverence that belied his inexperience, tracing the curve of my waist, the swell of my hips, as if mapping a territory he'd only dreamed of. My blouse fell open, the buttons yielding to his trembling fingers, and the cool air kissed my skin, followed by the heat of his mouth. Every touch was a spark, every sigh a confession, and I was lost in the rhythm of our bodies, the way they moved in sync, a dance of forbidden intimacy. I knew it was wrong. Every fibre of my being screamed it. But the wrongness only fueled the fire. His breath was ragged, his eyes dark with a need that mirrored my own, and I felt alive, truly alive, for the first time in years. My husband's indifference, the monotony of my days, the loneliness that had carved itself into my bones, all of it dissolved in the heat of Julian's touch. I was no longer Eleanor, the dutiful wife, the patient tutor. I was a woman reclaimed, burning with a desire I could neither control nor deny. When it was over, we lay there, breathless, the silence heavy with the weight of what we'd done. His fingers traced lazy circles on my arm, and I stared at the ceiling, the reality of our transgression crashing over me like a wave. I wanted to weep, to beg forgiveness from a God I wasn't sure I believed in, but I also wanted to pull him closer, to lose myself in him again. The conflict tore at me, a jagged wound that bled guilt and longing in equal measure. I dressed in silence, my hands shaking as I buttoned my blouse, each movement a step back toward the woman I was supposed to be. Julian watched me, his expression a mix of awe and uncertainty, and I wondered if he felt the same storm raging within him. "We can't do this again," I said, my voice hollow, but even as the words left my lips, I knew they were a lie. The hunger was too strong, the pull too magnetic. I was already falling, and there was no one to catch me. As I left his house, the night air cool against my flushed skin, I felt the weight of my sin settle into my bones. But beneath the shame, there was a spark, a flicker of something reckless and alive. I was a traitor to my vows, a betrayer of trust. But in that moment, I was also a woman who had tasted freedom, however fleeting. And God help me, I wanted more. The days that followed were a fever, a relentless pull between dread and desire that left me breathless. Each morning, I woke with the taste of Julian's name on my lips, my body still humming from the memory of his touch, while my mind churned with the weight of our secret. I told myself it was a mistake, a singular lapse that could be buried beneath apologies and resolve. But the truth was a living thing, clawing at my restraint. I saw him in every shadow, felt the ghost of his hands on my skin, and by the time our next lesson arrived, I was already unraveling. The study room felt smaller now, the air charged with an unspoken pact. Julian sat closer than necessary, his knee brushing mine under the table, a deliberate act that sent a shiver through me. His eyes held a new confidence, a spark of possession that both thrilled and terrified me. We opened our books, but the words blurred, meaningless against the pulse of anticipation. "Eleanor," he murmured, abandoning the pretense of study, "I can't stop thinking about you." His voice was a caress, low and intimate, and it broke something inside me, a dam I'd tried so desperately to hold. I should have stood, left the room, severed the thread before it wove us tighter, but instead, I leaned toward him, my breath catching as his hand found the curve of my neck. His touch was bolder now, less hesitant, as if he'd learned the map of my body in that single night. Our lips met, a collision of heat and urgency, and the world fell away. The table became our altar, papers scattering as he pressed himself against me, his body a tide pulling me under. My fingers dug into his shoulders, anchoring myself to him as we moved, a rhythm that was both reckless and inevitable. His shirt came off, revealing the lean planes of his chest, the faint sheen of sweat that glistened in the lamplight. I traced the lines of him, my hands greedy for the feel of his skin, the warmth that radiated from him like a furnace. He whispered my name, each syllable a spark that ignited something wild within me. My skirt slid higher, his hands guiding it with a reverence that belied the sin we were committing. The air was thick with our breaths, hot and ragged, mingling as our bodies sought each other, a dance of need that left no room for thought. Each encounter grew more daring, as if we were testing the limits of our defiance. In the quiet of his house, we found corners and shadows, places where the world couldn't reach us. The living room couch, the narrow hallway, the edge of his bed, all became sanctuaries for our stolen moments. His touch was a language now, speaking of hunger and discovery, and I answered with a fervour I hadn't known I possessed. His fingers wove through my hair, tugging gently as his lips explored the hollow of my throat, the curve of my collarbone, each kiss a brand that marked me as his. Yet with every touch, the guilt grew heavier, a shadow that clung to me even in the height of our passion. I saw my husband's face in fleeting moments, his distant eyes a reminder of the vows I'd shattered. I thought of Julian's parents, trusting me to guide their son, unaware of the betrayal unfolding under their roof. The shame was a physical thing, a weight in my chest that made it hard to breathe, but it was no match for the fire Julian kindled in me. In his arms, I was no longer the neglected wife, the invisible woman. I was desired, needed, alive in a way that made the world feel vivid again. One evening, as we lay tangled on his bedroom floor, the carpet soft beneath us, he traced the outline of my lips with his thumb, his eyes searching mine. "Do you regret it?" he asked, his voice soft but laced with something vulnerable. I wanted to lie, to tell him I regretted every second, but the truth was too raw. "I don't know," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I should, but you make me feel like I'm burning, Julian, like I'm finally awake." He kissed me then, slow and deep, and I felt the truth of my words settle into my bones. I was awake, but at what cost? The secrecy only heightened the intensity, each stolen moment a rebellion against the lives we were supposed to lead. We learned to move in silence, our bodies attuned to the slightest sound, a car in the driveway, a creak in the stairs. The danger was a drug, sharpening every sensation, making each touch feel like a theft from fate itself. I memorized the cadence of his breath, the way his muscles tensed under my hands, the soft sounds he made when we were lost in each other. It was a language of intimacy, one I hadn't spoken in years, and it filled the hollow places inside me, even as it tore me apart. But the guilt was relentless, a tide that rose higher with each encounter. I began to see it in the mirror, in the shadows under my eyes, the tightness of my smile. I wondered if others could see it too, my husband, my colleagues, the neighbours who waved as I passed. The fear of discovery was a constant hum, a blade poised above us, yet it only drove me deeper into Julian's arms. The contradiction was maddening. The same act that filled me with life was poisoning me with shame. As I left his house one night, the stars sharp against the velvet sky, I felt the weight of my choices settle heavier than ever. My body still thrummed with the memory of him, but my heart was a battleground, torn between the woman I'd been and the one I was becoming. I told myself I could stop, that I could reclaim the life I'd had before, but the lie tasted bitter. Julian was in my blood now, a fever I couldn't shake, and I was falling deeper into a darkness I both craved and feared. The nights with Julian became a rhythm, a pulse that dictated the cadence of my days. Each encounter carved deeper into me, etching lines of both ecstasy and anguish across my soul. I was no longer just Eleanor, the tutor who passed poetry and solved equations. I was a woman unmoored, adrift in a sea of forbidden desire that threatened to drown me. Yet, even as the guilt gnawed at my bones, I couldn't turn away. His touch was a tether, binding me to a version of myself I both loved and loathed, a woman who burned with life, even as she betrayed everything she'd once held dear. Our meetings grew reckless, the boundaries of caution eroding with each stolen hour. The study room was no longer enough. We sought out the hidden corners of his house, places where the world felt distant and our sin could breathe. One evening, in the dim glow of the basement, surrounded by forgotten boxes and the faint hum of a furnace, we collided with a desperation that bordered on madness. His hands were everywhere, mapping the contours of my body with a hunger that matched my own. My back pressed against the cool concrete wall, the contrast to his fevered skin sending shivers through me as we moved together, a symphony of whispered breaths and tangled limbs. His kisses were deeper now, laced with an intimacy that went beyond the physical. He learned the language of my body, the places that made me gasp, the rhythms that drew soft moans from my lips. My fingers traced the taut lines of his shoulders, the curve of his spine, memorizing him as if he were a secret I could keep forever. The air was heavy with the scent of dust and desire, our bodies swaying in a dance that felt both eternal and fleeting. Each touch was a confession, each sigh a plea, and I lost myself in the cadence of our connection, the way our breaths synchronized, the way our hearts seemed to beat as one. But the aftermath was always the same, a crashing wave of shame that left me hollow. As we lay there, our bodies still entwined, the reality of what we were doing pressed down on me, heavy and unyielding. I saw my husband's face, his indifference a stark contrast to Julian's fervour, and the comparison only deepened my guilt. I thought of Julian's future, the bright path I was tarnishing with my weakness, and the weight of it threatened to crush me. Yet even as I vowed to end it, Julian's hand would find mine, his touch a spark that reignited the fire within me, and I was powerless against it. Our conversations began to shift, the lines between teacher and student blurring into something more dangerous. He spoke of his dreams, his fears, his longing to be seen as more than a boy, and I listened, my heart aching with a tenderness that complicated everything. I told him of my own loneliness, the years spent fading into the background of my own life, and he looked at me with eyes that saw too much. "You deserve to be loved, Eleanor," he said one night, his voice soft but resolute, and the words pierced me, a truth I hadn't dared to face. In those moments, our connection felt like more than a transgression. It felt like salvation, however fleeting. Yet, the fear of discovery was a constant shadow, growing darker with each passing day. I began to notice the way his mother's gaze lingered when I arrived, the subtle tightening of her smile. I wondered if she sensed the change in me, the flush in my cheeks, the tremor in my hands. At home, my husband's silence felt heavier, as if he could see the betrayal written on my skin. I lived in a state of hypervigilance, every phone call, every knock at the door, a potential unraveling of our secret. The paranoia was exhausting, but it only drove me deeper into Julian's arms, as if he were the only refuge in a world closing in around me. One night, after a particularly fervent encounter in his bedroom, the sheets still warm beneath us, I felt the weight of my choices more acutely than ever. Julian's head rested on my chest, his breath steady and slow, and I stared at the ceiling, my mind a battlefield of conflicting desires. I wanted to protect him, to shield him from the consequences of our actions, but I also wanted to keep him, to hold on to the fire he'd awakened in me. The contradiction was tearing me apart, a jagged wound that bled guilt and longing in equal measure. I began to imagine ending it, rehearsing the words in my mind. We can't do this anymore. It's wrong. We have to stop. But the thought of losing him, of returning to the grey monotony of my life, was unbearable. He had become my oxygen, my reason to feel, and the idea of severing that connection filled me with a panic I couldn't name. I hated myself for my weakness, for the way I clung to him even as I knew it was destroying us both. The moral decay was palpable, a stain that spread with every touch, every whispered word. Yet I couldn't bring myself to wash it clean. As I left his house that night, the air cool against my flushed skin, I felt the storm within me raging stronger than ever. The stars above were indifferent, their light a cold reminder of the world beyond our secret. I was a traitor, a sinner, a woman who had crossed lines that could never be uncrossed. But I was also alive, my body thrumming with the memory of Julian's touch, my heart beating with a ferocity I'd thought long lost. The conflict was a living thing, twisting inside me, and I didn't know how much longer I could bear it. The line between salvation and ruin had blurred so completely that I no longer knew where I stood. Julian was both my anchor and my undoing, a paradox that consumed me with every stolen moment. Our encounters had become a ritual, a sacred defiance of the world's rules, and yet each one left me more fractured, my soul splintered between the ecstasy of his touch and the torment of my betrayal. I was a woman divided, teetering on the edge of a precipice, and the fall felt both inevitable and impossible to resist. That final week, the air itself seemed to hum with foreboding. We met in his room, the familiar space now a cathedral of our sin, the walls bearing witness to our reckless surrender. The lamplight cast shadows across his face, sharpening the angles of his jaw, and his eyes held a quiet intensity that made my breath catch. "Eleanor," he whispered, his voice a thread pulling me closer. "Stay with me tonight." The words were a plea, a temptation, and I felt the weight of them settle into my bones. I wanted to. God, how I wanted to. But the spectre of consequence loomed larger than ever, a shadow I could no longer ignore. We moved together with a desperation that felt like farewell, our bodies seeking solace in the only language we shared. His hands were gentle but insistent, tracing the curve of my spine, the softness of my thighs, as if committing me to memory. My fingers tangled in his hair, pulling him closer, and our lips met in a kiss that was both tender and fierce, a collision of longing and loss. The bed creaked beneath us, the rhythm of our bodies a pulse that drowned out the world, and for those fleeting moments I was whole again, my heart beating in time with his. His breath was hot against my skin, a wildfire that consumed every doubt, and I arched into him, my body a canvas for his touch. The air was thick with the scent of us, a heady mix of sweat and desire, and I clung to him, my nails digging into his shoulders as if I could hold on to this moment forever. Each movement was a confession, each sigh a prayer, and I felt myself unraveling, my soul laid bare in the heat of our connection. He whispered my name, a litany that anchored me even as it tore me apart, and I answered with a fervour that bordered on reverence, my body trembling with the intensity of it all. But the aftermath was a tidal wave, crashing over me with a force that left me gasping. As we lay there, our breaths slowing. The silence was deafening, heavy with the truth we'd tried to outrun. I saw the future in stark clarity, the scandal, the shame, the lives we'd destroy if our secret spilled into the light. Julian's hand rested on my waist, his touch a comfort I no longer deserved, and I felt the weight of my choices crushing me. I had betrayed my husband, my vows, my own moral compass. But worse, I had betrayed Julian, pulling him into a darkness that could scar him for years. "I can't keep doing this," I said, my voice barely a whisper, the words slicing through the quiet. He stiffened beside me, his hand tightening for a moment before falling away. "Eleanor, don't," he said, his voice raw with something close to panic. "We're not hurting anyone. It's ours." But his words only deepened the ache in my chest. We were hurting everyone, even if they didn't know it yet. And the lie of our secrecy was a poison seeping into every corner of my life. I sat up, pulling the sheet around me, my body still humming with the memory of him, but my heart heavy with resolve. "This is wrong, Julian. You know it is. I'm your teacher. I'm married. We've gone too far." My voice broke, and I hated the weakness in it, the way it betrayed my longing even as I tried to end it. He reached for me, his fingers grazing my arm, and the touch was a spark, threatening to reignite the fire I was trying to extinguish. "I don't care about that," he said, his eyes fierce. "I care about you. I love you." The words were a knife, cutting through the last of my defenses. Love. It was a word I hadn't dared to speak, a truth I'd buried beneath the heat of our encounters. But hearing it from him, so raw and unguarded, shattered something inside me. I wanted to believe it, to let it justify everything. But love in this context was a betrayal, a theft from the life I was supposed to lead. "You can't," I said, my voice trembling. "You're too young. This isn't love. It's a mistake." I stood, dressing quickly, my hands shaking as I buttoned my blouse, each movement a step toward the woman I needed to be. Julian watched me, his expression a mix of anger and hurt, and I felt the distance between us growing, a chasm I both needed and dreaded. "You don't mean that," he said, but there was a question in his voice, a crack in his certainty. I wanted to turn back, to fall into his arms and let the world burn, but I forced myself to move, to walk toward the door, each step heavier than the last. Outside, the night was cold, the stars sharp and unforgiving. I stood on the sidewalk, my breath visible in the air, and felt the storm within me raging stronger than ever. I had ended it, or tried to, but the pull of Julian was still there, a current I wasn't sure I could resist. The fear of discovery lingered, a blade poised above me, but now it was joined by a new fear, the emptiness of a life without him. I was a traitor, a sinner, a woman who had tasted freedom and now faced the cage of her own making. As I walked home, the city silent around me, I wondered if I'd truly severed the thread, or merely delayed the inevitable. Julian's love, my betrayal, our secret. It was a fire that had burned too brightly, and I didn't know if I could ever escape its ashes. The future was a shadow, vast and uncertain, and I was alone in it, carrying the weight of a love I could neither keep nor fully let go.